So Dr. Norman Farb is going to be speaking on the neuroscience of human emotions. What can we learn? Please join me to welcome him back on stage.
All right, good afternoon again. Very nice to kind of see you again. It must be very nice for you to see me at least. Yeah, so that's good. So today I'm going to try to make a bit of a shift from yesterday. Yesterday was kind of waxing philosophical about the big picture of bringing science together with contemplative studies, with Buddhist studies. And today I'm going to try to make that a bit more concrete by talking about one line of research into human emotions and the neuroscience of human emotions and how that informs our understanding of wellness, of wholesome emotional states, and suffering, unwholesome emotional states. And I want to frame that just by qualifying it right at the beginning by saying that there's going to be many different facets of wholesome and unwholesome states. And my intention here is to just give you something more concrete that links up perhaps with Buddhist theory rather than to do anything exhaustive in the time that we have. So I'll go back to that sort of mock-up I had of the Visuddhimagga at the end of my talk yesterday, in which there's supposed to be this progression of capacities, right, or progression of stages. And of course, it's not completely linear. The arrows here feed back on each other as well, if you will. But this idea that a lot of our practices begin with sensory awareness, and then from sensory awareness, this leads to a sort of more distributed or more stable form of awareness of experience in general. And this is a cool kind of story. It gives you a sort of a roadmap for maybe how early practice will go. And I would also assert that it's eminently testable by science, right? If it is the case that growing to become more aware of momentary feelings and sensations in your body is a foundation for later practice, and we can find good ways of measuring this potential growth in awareness, we can test how necessary this awareness of feelings really is for this positive trajectory, this growth trajectory, right? Because you might ask yourself, well, if most of my problem is that I have these negative thoughts about myself, why am I spending all this time on feelings? Like, what's with that, right? And I think it's good to question those things, right? Like, it's good to have a complete understanding of why you're doing the things you're doing, because we'd like to be efficient with our time, right? Our time is so limited day to day and also on this planet, that if we're doing 8 steps and only 3 of them are necessary, it would be nice to know that those steps aren't that necessary. So why does mindful attention towards these visceral habits promote change? Why do we want to turn to sensory experience and sort of throw open these sense gates? A lot of the times, neuroscience reports are permeated by stories of how our visceral feeling experience is actually a sign of pathology, right? So I was asked to try to include a discussion of the amygdala in this talk. You hear, oh, my amygdala is firing too much, that's why I'm miserable. Well, that's not really why you're miserable. That's another way of discussing, your misery, that you have this brain sensor that's supposed to tell you if things are emotionally important and it's going crazy, so you feel completely constrained in your attention that you have to attend to this emotionally important thing. And if that emotionally important thing isn't nice, well, now you're stuck there. So the amygdala gets sort of vilified and stuff like that. So that seems a little bit counterintuitive to this idea of turning towards sensation. Like, why would I want to turn up that signal? So I'm going to talk about a line of research that explains at least one situation where trying to turn back towards sensation actually would be really beneficial, just as having the ability to turn away from that sensation when it's overwhelming is also an important capacity. But I'm not going to focus as much on that today. There are other lines of research that show that meditation training also improves that ability to turn away from sensation. But let me tell you the story I wanted to tell today. We can think of emotions in generally as being constructed of 2 kind of major things, and I think this should resonate back to Sara's discussion of pain, between the sensory aspects of pain and then what we make pain mean. It resonates back to Jim Austin's talk yesterday about how you have this sort of system that gets deeply selfing and talks about like the implications for the self, and that's different than this system that just tells us what's actually happening, seeing things as they are in the world, including our sensations. So there's this idea that there are these kind of 2 systems at play. And these systems can be thought of as being constitutive right? Helping to make up our emotional experience, right? This kind of conditioned visceral response, like the last time this happened, something bad happened, so I feel something intense and perhaps negative in my body, and that's part of my emotional experience, but it's not all of my emotional experience, because I also have to contextualize, so why am I feeling this? What does this arousal mean right before giving a talk? Am I nervous or excited, or maybe a little bit of both? And so I need to sort of have this kind of conceptual overlay, this integration of sensation with a sense of self to really have a full-blown emotional experience as we tend to think about it. And those of you trying to think ahead about what I'm going to talk about might start to muse that either of these processes could go awry, right? If they're working nicely in concert, we sort of have a sense of how things are, and we understand how we should relate to what is. But you could have issues with either part of this sensation, and for a given person who's suffering, it may not be clear just talking about them what's going wrong in their emotional processing that's leading to suffering. But if we have a kind of neuroscience account, again, we might be able to peek at what's going on behind the scenes that leads to this broader appraisal of I'm suffering, or I can't handle things, or life is hopeless, or so on or so forth. Many of the reports that you get from someone who's suffering from an affliction such as a chronic depression or anxiety disorder. So what makes an emotion wholesome or unwholesome? Well, we can leverage contemplative practice and also people's reports of suffering to try to tease this apart. And the way I've tried to do it, which comes from a line of emotion researchers, is to actually provoke people to be in a negative emotional state. And I do that with film clips most of the time. So we'll have people in the brain scanner, in the functional MRI, and we'll show them either sort of neutral film clips as a baseline, which is mostly like home and garden television. Now I know there's some passionate gardeners here who are like, that is not neutral, but it's but it's relatively neutral, right? It's like the best potted plant for summer, or like wicker basket construction techniques, and we'll compare that to these really sad themes of loss, right? So a kid loses his estranged boxer father, and the champ meets up with him, and he fights one more fight, and he wins the fight. They don't see any of that. They see him like succumbing to his injuries afterwards, and the kid just loses. He's like, champ, wake up. He doesn't even know his dad well enough to call him anything but champ. It's super sad. Or terms of endearment, a mom saying goodbye to her kids because she has terminal cancer. So nothing kind of violent or gory, but these themes of loss. And we look at what changes in the brain between watching a few of these sad film clips compared to neutral film clips as an index of this emotional response. And then what we can do is try to match up differences between people in that emotional response with who's suffering and who's not, right? So we're trying to make everyone sad, but not everyone is suffering in terms of like their overall appraisal of how things are going in their lives. Kind of follow me so far, right? So we have people to sort of push this along. We have people who've completed mindfulness training, these 8-week courses, who clinically are better off than the people who are in that randomized waitlisted control. So everyone signs up for the study. Half of them we scan after they've done training. Half of them we randomly assign to do the scanning before they do the training. And then again, we try to see what correlates between the neural pattern of reactivity and their broader symptoms of depression in this case. So when you look at untrained, relatively secular Westerners, we get two really big patterns when we expose people to these sad film clips. One of them is all along the cortical midline of the brain. This is that kind of selfing network, right? The what does it mean about me sort of network that we've heard about a few times before. This is the network that cap on the thalamus is supposed to shut down if it can somehow be engaged in kensho. Okay, but this network turns on very strongly in response to negative films. People can't help but try to figure out how they relate as a person, as a self, to the emotions that they're feeling. They can't help it. And this is kind of where I thought, in retrospectively naive sort of way, this is where the action in meditation was going to be. It was just about early meditation practice, dissolve the self. Done. But what we also saw was this other pattern that wasn't as expected, and that was a trade-off for engaging so much of the selfing network is that a lot of those sensory regions that I spoke briefly about yesterday get turned off when you deeply engage with the self. So it's like, okay, I feel this intense sensation, and one way to escape from it is to try to just understand it conceptually in terms of my self-reference and not really engage anymore with these waves of incoming emotion. And so for the average adult Westerner in our studies, what sadness looks like in the brain is not just these floods of emotion, which is sort of how I'd conceptualize it. Like you see like a 5-year-old who's sad and like every orifice is pouring fluid out and they're just like, wow, like they're getting hit by these waves. Adults aren't like that, right? Most adults sort of withdraw, dissociate, get really cognitive, right? They start ruminating. And that's the pattern we're starting to see. And the cool thing is we can ask a few questions. What does the contemplative training do to this pattern? And then how does this relate to overall well-being or suffering? So, so this is showing you these are some of the sensory areas that are turning off in blue. So once people do mindfulness training, we see that some of this selfing network, especially in this posterior midline region, which is where some of that inhibitory cap from the thalamus that Jim Austin talked about before is innervating, turns down a bit, but they're still selfing. Like, they still can't help relate things to themselves. But what we see also is that this inhibition of the sensory regions, including the insula here, and you could think of amygdala as being part of this family if you wanted to hear about the amygdala. All of this inhibition of these regions stops. So relative to watching home and garden television, you're still letting yourself feel your body when you see these really negative film clips. And why this is relevant is when we look at people's initial sadness ratings in the scanner, we don't necessarily see big differences in reported sadness. But what we do see is when we look at people's broader depression symptoms, so people report being equally sad in response to the films, but they vary in how depressed they are overall. The more people are dissociating away from sensory experience, the more they're shutting off new information coming in from their bodies and the rest of their senses, that's what's predicting depression, not how selfie they get. It's the consequence of getting so wrapped up in yourself that you're no longer taking in new sensory information that really seems to be pathological in this study. In further studies where we look at people with histories of depression and again give them these sort of film tasks and try to see what is it about their reactions in the film task when they've recovered from depression that predicts becoming depressed again in the future, the next year or two, we can see both of these sort of effects at play, that if people use their prefrontal cortex too much, they tend to relapse in depression. But also if they turn off visual cortex, if they learn not to turn off their visual cortex, they learn to keep that body awareness and visual awareness going. They don't shut off sensation. They're protected from depression. So it's not just about trying to destroy the self right away, right? Like, how do you think conceptually about destroying conceptual thought? One of the first sort of moves that people can make is actually stopping letting conceptual thought completely block out the ability to take in new sensory information. And if you can start to really attend to sensory information and really practice turning towards sensory information, then there's a possibility of dehabituating, deconditioning, always turning exclusively to conceptual thought in the face of stress. And that can be transformative. And over time, less and less reliance on conceptual thought may actually weaken those selfing networks. But the first step is not just break up the self. The first is do something that's not just focusing on yourself as this conceptual narrative, a collection of traits that extends over time. Even though we need to do that to get by in society, doing that exclusively seems to be really harmful. We have another really large study now where, again, we looked at a much larger cohort of around 85 people who had a history of depression, and again found that turning off the somatosensory cortex in response to stress is what predicts relapse. Everyone dissociates a little bit when they feel something bad, right? You don't want to feel that intense negative feeling, but if it's an extreme dissociation, which are the red bars here, that really predicts that you're going to relapse the next few years, right? Not that you're just engaged in self-referential thinking that we tend to all do. So one way to understand the earliest stages of contemplative practice, and I admit this is just that first box in that long arc of things that are supposed to change as you practice contemplative practice, is stopping both lapsing into just pure automatic evaluation and analysis of conceptual thought, but also to limit automatic dissociation from feelings that are intense or unfamiliar or downright unpleasant. And by being able to have that more balanced perspective, the self-narrative, it doesn't become the all-encompassing reality. Yes, it is known that there are these thoughts, but there are also other things occurring. And that's when we talk about decentering, the thought about the self is not the only game in town. So it doesn't appear as capital T truth. It's just true that I had this thought right now. And also I'm having these body sensations, and maybe those things are changing in unexpected ways that don't let me just continue on with the same negative narrative the whole time. So I want to just come back full circle to how I started and saying dissociation from visceral experience is only one form of suffering that seems to be really deeply connected to depression. Having too much sensory experience is also a problem, and so there must also be skillfulness in being able to turn off these sense gates and go into a more conceptual analytic place. And indeed, there is evidence to suggest that people who are high in mindfulness skills can do that more efficiently. They can turn on their prefrontal cortex and label experience and turn off their amygdala. And what I think more broadly we should think about, instead of just this dichotomy of too much or too little feeling, is that we're all trying to walk this path towards having wholesome lives, good lives, and we may all have very individual forms of suffering predicated upon different patterns of dysfunction or unwholesome conditioning in our emotional reactions. And trying to distinguish between those kind of categories of dysfunction, I think, is absolutely critical if we're going to efficiently be able to address the sources of suffering. So even if there is one primal source of suffering behind everything else, it may manifest in very different ways. And it behooves us all, whether you're a contemplative practitioner, a clinician, a neuroscientist, to start forming taxonomies for, well, what are these different categories of suffering, these different instantiations or appearances of suffering, and then what are the most skillful ways to address them? And perhaps there are very different contemplative practices that might address dissociation compared to being overwhelmed with experience, for instance. And hopefully we can kind of walk this road together so that when we hit that same challenge, that same stress feeling we had before, now we have a chance to do something new. And if we're in that kind of experimentation, I can do something new with my experience instead of it just always being the same hopeless story it always was. Now there's potential for growth. And I would just leave you with that idea that if we can get onto that idea that we're experimenting, growing, trying to improve our lot and the lot of others, we're in a really good place to succeed in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farb, for sharing much of the scientific research and also to add a little to our confusion here. So I'm going to put this challenge to Ajahn Brahm to disentangle some of our confusion later on in your session and how practice of non-self correlates or doesn't correlate with the disassociation. And of course, if you don't understand words like taxonomy and meta-awareness, you're normal. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to invite yet another scientist you are going to enlighten us, right? Okay. So it's going to be on the neuroscience of happiness and its practical applications in day-to-day life. And you've got a machine to do that for us. That's even better. We just kind of hook in and turn it on. Okay, let's invite Dr. Philippe Goldin, please.
Okay. Here we go. You ready? I will ask you to participate again a little bit. So continuing from the talk yesterday, if you remember. Yes. Emotions. So I'm going to just put it out there to start with. I think the emotions are a source of information. You don't need to necessarily to control or suppress them, and in fact, to use it as a friend. Information from moment to moment. But I think that this relates to two important things. How we views, adaptive and maladaptive, of self, and also then how compassion meditation training impacts this whole beautiful system. So, the self. Take that in. Ready? Close your eyes. I'm going to have you do something. First person data. Collect your own data right now. I'm going to guide you in a brief practice. See a version of yourself moments after you came out of your mother's womb. You were born this beautiful, small creature. Cared for, loved, held, fed. Shift to when you were about 20 years old, that version of yourself. Who is that person? Just notice your reactivity, responses. Shift to the present, the person sitting right here in the chair this moment. Who is that version of yourself right this moment? Shifting forward in time, a few seconds before you take your last breath of this lifespan. That version of yourself that's about to let go. Who is that person? The sense of self across time over the lifespan. And now open your eyes. This is the circuit that you were just activating this very moment in each of your brains. This midline self-referential processing that Dr. Norman Farb was actually helping us look at. So this is a result of a meta-analysis, data from many, many different studies. Well, you can see there are three primary components, the red, the green, the blue, that make up self-referential processing, conceptual, language-based, conceptual-based view of yourself. And you were just activating that circuit this moment. A beautiful target for us to begin to probe. So then one of the questions that we asked is, so what's the effect of mindfulness-based stress reduction for about 2 months on this specific brain network in adults who have anxiety disorders? And what we found, jumping to the punchline, look at the green. This dorsal medial prefrontal cortical area, which I saw was activated in your brain data as well, that increased pre-post 2 months of mindfulness meditation training. The degree to which the neural activity increased actually predicted reduction in social anxiety, and it predicted increases in mindfulness skills from pre to post. So beginning to look at specific components of this conceptual self-view network, is it modifiable? When it's modified, what is the impact in clinical symptoms and mindfulness skills? So this is only one study. It has to be replicated. But the way that we can actually adapt our sense of self, be it a conceptual sense of self, an embodied, visceral, sensory sense of self, and probably many other modes of self-processing for which we don't have labels yet. I would suggest, and this is about the future, that we're constantly shifting from conceptual, visceral, felt, and other modes of self, millisecond to millisecond. And it has to do that how we collapse that and train that through intentional practice makes those different modes of self accessible and controllable or malleable. And obviously, the sense of self then leads to empathy in my model, which then leads to the 4 Brahma Viharas: compassion, love, equanimity, joy. Look at this picture. Notice what your brain is doing. What's the narrative story your brain is doing as you see 4 faces on the screen? Bliss, sadness. So, say 20 years ago, no respectable scientist would be studying empathy and compassion. Now it is all the rage. And some of the top scientists on the planet are actually studying this. But if your notion of compassion is to become angelic, then you are setting yourself up for failure. If we put the bar so high, then we may never actually have the intention, motivation to go for it. On the other hand, it's really important to understand the same human capacities that we have in our mind and brain that allow us to develop a care for others can also lead to discouraging, deprecating others. So this young woman was born, loved, cared for, educated, but context matters. Abu Ghraib, Iraq, how can a person, begin to develop a model that treats another fellow human being as if it was not a human being? Unfortunately, or fortunately, unfortunately, we all have this capacity. So that's something to really be humble about. She is not so different from me, right? But then I like this quote from a cellist, Pablo Casal: I feel the capacity to care, even in a tour of duty, even in the middle of a war, is the thing that which gives life its deepest significance. So we also have the capacity to drop in a moment, as needed, for the benefit of others. So ready? Stand up, please. And just silently, just look at me. Very short contemplation. You can do it with each other, but we're just going to do it this way. I am everyone in this moment. This person in front of me, in front of you, wishes to be happy, to be well, to be loved, just like you. This person standing in front of you has had pain, suffering, angst, just like you. This person in front of you wishes to fulfill wishes, to lead a meaningful life, to achieve a state of contentment, just like each of you. This person in front of you is going to die, disintegrate. Earth, water, fire, air, elements, just like you. Please sit down. So this is a much longer meditation that we do. That is one type of interconnectivity practice, you can say. And interconnectivity because we normally do it in dyads. And what happens is we begin to break down the illusion of separateness. Viscerally, you feel it in your body. If I did this for 30 minutes in a row and took you deeper, 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 deeper. Conceptually, and we also know from neuroscience, in fact, just from brain science, we are constantly pinging, interacting, and influencing each other all the time. The visual cortex makes us think or perceive each of us as if we were separate. Just from a brain science perspective, that is complete illusion. Complete illusion. The visual field somehow overwhelms what the actual reality. Interesting challenge. And so we can, and we are constantly doing this, influencing each other's sense of self. And in fact, really good teachers are doing this constantly, regulating emotions, language, emotion regulation, sense of self in their students. That is a whole field of study no one has touched yet. Be it psychotherapist and patient, friend, teacher and student. One of my favorite slides. I'm a father. Happy Father's Day. Human animals, us, each of us, months after we came out of the mother's womb, had the capacity to engage our caregivers. We made these little faces and we mimic the facial expressions of the others. This is the social glue. We human animals are born with a little bit of neural architecture in place to be able to create this intense emotional, social connection with our caregivers. Pre-language, pre-thought. Wow, go biology. This is called the mirror neuron system. 5 minutes. We saw it, there's a beautiful system that actually essentially is this, that we can create a model of how another person is feeling and actually create and mimic their emotional state. So Tanya Singer, one of my favorite neuroscientists on the planet, beautiful research showing that empathy, a building block for compassion, the ability to have empathy, we can actually begin to tease out where in the brain that's happening. And it necessarily involves perspective taking. Enough about me, how about the other? You can actually see that shift occurring in the brain. Back to telomeres. Here's something that the women in the room are going to really be happy about. Beautiful study, Elizabeth Hodge, MGH, showing, I think it was 6 weeks, I hope I'm correct, of loving kindness meditation in men and women randomized to get the meditation or a control group that did not meditate. And here what you see is the telomere length. Longer is better. Those are the caps on the chromosomes that are the biomarkers of when I'm going to die. And what you see in red is that women who did the loving kindness meditation, not only did they preserve the length, it actually increased in length. As far as I know, it's the only study so far that has shown that anything increases the length, which is protective, as opposed to normal degradation. Really provocative. So Stanford, compassion cultivation training, a group of us got together to make a program, 8 weeks long, and it's stabilizing the mind, loving kindness meditation, compassion meditation practices, shared humanity, Tonglen, giving and taking, integrated practice, to see if can we offer some kind of a program. Only 8 weeks, super short, only a couple of practices as opposed to many, many, many. But what did we find? First of all, we conceptualized compassion as having 4 specific factors. Cognitive factor, affective or emotion factor, intention to reduce the suffering of others, and a motivation to take action in a context-dependent way. So really breaking this down, and now we've given this scale to more than 10,000 people all over the planet to see how well it captures these different components. So what do we know? This is what we found. After 8 weeks, community sample, compassion towards others increased, self-report. Compassion for oneself also increased, and then also being the recipient of other people's compassion, very difficult, increased. We also found anxiety decreased, stress, calm went up, caring for self, caring for others, mind wandering to pleasant thoughts increased. Mind wandering is not a bad thing, necessarily. Context dependent. Expressing emotions increased, giving your own time, which I think is much more valuable than money, increased. Daily experience sampling, every day, twice, for 11 weeks, up to 144 measurements per person. Temporal dynamics of change over time. What do we find? The amount of, so we pinged you, if you meditated, then there was a 6.5 times greater likelihood that you engaged in a caring behavior for yourself. Remember, over 11 weeks, every single day. If you had meditated, either in the AM or the PM, there was a 3.5 times increase in caring behaviors for others. Whoa, that's a big difference, both significant, but look at that, towards self. Moving, shifting care for others, for self. So why is that important? Because again, these are all building blocks in the contemplative developmental trajectory to actually get to skillful means, upaya, to develop profound, sustained inner peace, not momentary, that then contributes to the stream, to the river, to the ocean of world peace. And we need this more than ever. Brain is functionally connected in amazing ways that we don't even yet understand. The whole world, planet Earth at least, is interconnected in ways that we understand a little bit. And here's a final quote. A human being is part of the whole, Einstein, called by us the universe. He, she experiences himself, herself, his thoughts, feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for just a few. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goldin, for that vote, scientific vote for loving kindness practice. So I think all of us should be going for loving kindness retreats more, especially our spouses, right? And I could name also a few people that really should be going for this, apart from the people in the Middle East, is Donald Trump. So if you can take this to the White House, I think you would be changing the world in a very big way. Yeah. So that was a very thought-provocative presentation. It kind of pops the question up as a Buddhist, when we are striving to be more humble, how does that relate to a larger self and the play of the ego? As far as I understand, the more enlightened you are, the smaller your ego or the sense of self becomes. So anybody claiming to be enlightened should really go for this fMRI scan to prove it. So that way, when you have monks or whoever saying, I'm enlightened, we'll say, okay, let's prove it by MRI scan. And when you are fully enlightened, then you really have no ego. But first stage of enlightenment, as far as I know, you still have an ego. So that's going to be really interesting. Okay. Yes, we have one question there. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hello. My name is Cyril Veeratunga. I'm an engineer by my background. My question is for the whole panel. Some time ago, I had a motor car accident and I had a lot of pain and various other problems, but something I could remember is that this side of my head, there was a lot of pain. I went through physiotherapy and all that. It didn't help. But I noticed when I have a loving compassion feeling, there's some activity in my brain.
Thank you. And your question, sir?
And my question is, I'm not sure whether that is connected to relief of this pain, and I was curious what is going on in my brain.
Okay. So I think in interest of time and probably more questions be coming, so can I direct this to Dr. Goldin, please?
Yes.
Since you talked about loving kindness and...
A lot is happening in the brain, and we don't know. I mean, you wouldn't actually sense anything in the brain because there are actually there are no sensors. I mean, you can't actually feel sensation that's happening in the brain. But I mean, everything is connected to everything in the brain, but I don't know.
Okay. Would you like to add, Dr. Farb?
Well, this is speculation, which I like doing. It's just that if you think about the context of living knowing that you've had an injury that's causing you pain, in some ways the person you're being a lot of times is like waiting for the next pain signal, right? So what your brain is being trained to do is detect the pain. And then if you start doing loving kindness practice, now you're waiting for the presence of something different that's not pain, right? Where's compassion? Where's love? So in some ways, what the front of the brain is getting ready to receive might be changing. So it's not that there isn't still radiating pain signal, unfortunately, hitting your brain, but now it has to compete with something else that the brain is waiting for. And maybe that competition dilutes the importance of the pain, if not the sensory part of the pain. So that could be one reason why something shifts, even if the sensation of pain isn't completely gone. It might be less bothersome, yeah?
Thank you. Okay, so we'll have the next question, please.
My name is Mary, and I teach mindfulness to teens. And my current project right now is to increase that diversity and generally make mindfulness more inclusive to marginalized communities. And loving kindness has been one of the practices that have been really helping in the programs that I've looked at. And my question is, when it comes to dealing with the systemic whole of systemic racism, how best can we support that with studies, neuroscientific studies on how systemic racism affects individuals?
Thank you. Who would like to take that question?
Well, I mean, I don't know about neuroscientific studies because we study individual brains at a time, but there's a great organization called Courage of Care that's based in Oakland and all over, and it's basically taking the arc of contemplative practice from mindfulness to compassion into social justice, racial bias, action. And they're taking that energy and momentum into neighborhoods, organizations, Courage of Care. And I'm actually taking their online training now. And I think it's a beautiful projection of all the internal practice into social justice, bias, implicit biases. There's a lot of people, but I don't know about neuroscience can look at individual people and look at where do biases appear in the brain, et cetera. But I think it's more about actually motivating the action, the bodhisattva action tendencies to engage in motivating organizations, groups, et cetera. I mean, neuroscience can contribute a little bit, but not much of that.
There's two studies now demonstrating that, not about that so much, but that there's something called implicit bias, which is sort of automatic tendencies about how people think about people. And there's been two studies now showing that compassion training can change that, including racial biases, even after a single session of compassion training in individuals. And so it's not exactly your question, but I just think it's really wonderful studies, two really wonderful studies that I think it's more people hopefully would know about, that we really can potentially help decrease racial biases in our countries if more people were to practice compassion.
But who was it earlier? Yeah, I mean, you were speaking about non-harm, developing a orientation of non-harm. So if compassion is shifting and orienting the mind to sensitize to the suffering, pain, angst, insecurity of others, and if that is followed by training in not harming others, but you need that on an organizational level. And I think you mentioned that's how you keep your 25 monks in line in a group, is that everyone is trying to develop that same sensibility and same quality, same motivation. That's what we need on a much larger level. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Yeah, hello, my name is Rodolfo. I'm volunteering. I'm not a caregiver or anything. The question is to the panel, but it was triggered by one of the slides from Dr. Goldin. In your slide, when you did the effect on telomeres and meditation, there was a big difference between men and women. Women showed a statistically significant difference, while men didn't. So how do you interpret that or explain that?
Have ideas?
I suspect it has more to do with men have a harder time doing it initially, is my guess, that they're more reactive to it, and so they may not be practicing it or may not be practicing it the same way. I mean, that's my sense of things, is that most guys I know don't like compassion meditation when they first start it.
Yeah, and actually what we found in our studies at Stanford, doing and continuing of compassion meditation training for 2 months, men tend at baseline, before they even got the training, if you looked at compassion for others, for self, receiving compassion from others, men tended to be much lower. Women tended to be much higher at baseline, just from the get-go. But that also means that there was more space to move up for the men. But it does suggest, and it's provocative, if that's really a moderator, or if that's something that's really different at baseline, that's different between the genders, is there a way of modifying compassion meditation training to make it more applicable to males?
Palpable.
And more palpable for males. That's one question that arises in the mind. And from a Buddhist perspective, if the practices are really gender neutral, then they should be equally effective. Now, we're talking at beginning stages, not later stages. But it's harder for men generally to drop into loving kindness. And women have that biology, that really of vasopressin and oxytocin, that from the get-go creates affiliation. Having said that, you saw that science slide of the father and the child. It is possible to drop into that biologically developed social glue if we allow ourselves. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yes, there's hope.
Perhaps women have been developing compassion much longer in time. I mean, from the time that you give birth to a child, I mean, there's just a huge amount of compassion you need to have to care for a child, right? And when they become teenagers, my gosh, that's like maximum development. Okay. Any other questions?
Hello, dear community. Thank you so much. I'm just sitting in the front here. My name is Sister Ocean from the community of Thich Nhat Hanh, and very glad, also an Ontarian, very grateful to have this conference here. I'm not sure if I fully understood Mary's question, but it's also a similar question that I want to pose. I think perhaps the focus got a little detoured, so I'm just going to, I don't know if it's reframing Mary's question, but again, it's perhaps just a new question. When looking at sharing mindfulness practices, I think it's a continuation also of the last question. Noticing, say something like sharing loving kindness, if there are sort of baseline differences of effective practices for, say, men and women, maybe we would want to look at adapting it. And also what Dr. Farb had talked about, depending upon where people are coming from, maybe there are some skillful practices that we can focus on to begin with. And the interpretation that I'm taking from Mary's question, which is also my question, is that marginalized communities tend to face a lot more trauma. That's, more and more, the term post-traumatic slavery syndrome and other things are able to be improved on a neurological level. Dr. Wing Su's work around microaggressions, etc. There's psychological and some neurobiological information. So if we take this from the lens of individuals, but knowing that there is a community social factor of trauma. Let's talk about trauma. Some practices that are really important to focus on. So similarly in my community, we focus a lot on breath meditation, but there's always some folks who come, they can't focus on breath. And mostly I end up talking to women, and mostly I found out there's been sexual trauma. So that's also not necessarily the same degree of, the same type of trauma that perhaps racially marginalized community or sexual gender minorities are facing. But is there anything around the research of So if we look at this from trauma and mindfulness, compassion practices that seem to be more effective, and I think we could interpret that into looking at how to share practices in marginalized communities, because it's really important to look at how dominant groups are perpetuating, and we all have our biases, but it's also really important to recognize there's different nuances, which I think was starting to get touched upon, and I'm really excited by this work. So it's a bit of a long question, but I'm so excited to have the expertise here, and maybe the monks who will be in the next panel can continue that. Thank you.
I mean, I know that in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is what I was trained in through graduate school, there's now trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, or forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the number one empirically supported form of psychotherapy for depression, anxiety, and many things. But now really trauma-informed and sensitive. There's also another form that the first time I saw it 2 years ago, it's been around for 45 years, but culturally sensitive. Because what we do is we say, oh, this is really good and it works for everybody. Well, that's kind of a rough, gross view. It's really good in how do we understand the different specific cultures. So if you're working with Hmong people, or people who are first generation from Asia, or et cetera, et cetera. There are many different variations. How do you modify the training or the treatment or the medicine, the intervention, to really be maximally beneficial? I mean, even a larger, that's one question. Be it trauma or specific cultures. Now, I don't think we've actually done that work in clinical or scientific research to really take into account where in the power structure people are. This courage of care does. That's why I mentioned it. It is totally about racism, implicit bias, dominant structures. That's why it's so interesting. And it's contemplatively based and informed. But most forms of psychotherapy, and I don't think anything in MBSR or cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based cognitive, I mean, all these labels, they've not really taken in a lot about where the culture and where in the hierarchy people are coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a sensitivity to, I mentioned in my talk that for some people it's not a dissociation, it's they're being flooded by this deeply triggering past event. And I think there's a sensitivity to the idea that you don't want to start someone's practice at the place where they are most deeply conditioned to re-experience their trauma. So for a lot of people, that's in the chest, like where the breath is. And so it might not be the most skillful, as you say, to begin there, even if eventually you would like them to renegotiate.
Or even body scan.
Or even body scans.
Body scan can be very provocative, depending where you're coming from.
But there's a difference between saying, oh, this is conditioned versus like it's unworkable. And so, for instance, a collaborator of mine is a lady named Cynthia Price, who's in the School of Nursing at the University of Washington, who's developed a mindfulness awareness-based touch therapy, which is geared, it's a one-on-one therapy as opposed to a group version, and it's geared towards first establishing a sense of trust and comfort with the therapist. And then it does still play with body awareness, but it's scaffolded very, very carefully. So it begins actually from the outside in. So you trust your therapist. I'm going to touch your hand now. Can you feel this touch? And so you're literally like holding their hand through a practice. So this doesn't necessarily address issues of culture or power differential, but it does take into account that there's going to be a different access point to the practices for someone who has a history of trauma. Now, on the optimistic or more hopeful side, some of the very largest studies of techniques like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy indicate that people with a history of trauma may be the strongest responders. So if you can find that access point to them, similar to this idea that men maybe start off down here so they have more room to improve, there's this great potential for healing there because they're starting off so dissociated from their bodies. So if you can help them to negotiate through that dissociation in a skillful way, titrated to how much they can handle, which is much easier to do one-on-one perhaps than in a group setting, things can really change. Another point I really wanted to mention, I think evidence is just starting to come out, is that you have much greater efficacy in a mindfulness intervention if you are like the people you're teaching to. And so it's not like, I don't think brain science is like the most efficient way to get here. If you can train someone who's from a marginalized community to deliver the intervention and they can manifest those qualities, you already fought half the battle of the power differential, right? Because it's no longer like white male telling someone else like this is how you ought to do things like the past several thousand years of human history. It becomes like this is someone who has gone through what I've gone through. And then so the challenge becomes how do you recruit and find that potential in people in marginalized communities who can then carry it forward within those communities, I think is a really rich area that doesn't involve neuroscience, but it makes sense, you know. So I think there's a lot of amazing work that could be done there as well.
Thank you. And there's another question there, sir. Please go ahead.
Yes, my name's John McAlevey, and I'm a psychiatrist south of Buffalo here, and I work for the state now, but I have a question that's maybe a little bit academic, but also practical, and I've heard it said a couple times that in order to transcend the ego, first you have to have a healthy ego, and the other, I just want to make a comment that a lot of therapists now are using mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and also the dialectic behavioral therapy, which is also mindfulness-based and more towards very emotional people. So.
Do you have to have a strong? Do you need to have a healthy, or I would say clearly functioning
I think
ego?
that's a question for the monks. I have no idea.
But I do think it resonates a bit with the question yesterday about what's the danger of teaching mindfulness as it is now without also having ethics built in. I think this is exactly the issue. That if you're trying to teach someone to deconstruct their conditioned habits and they don't have a foundation of wanting to be good and care for other people and be cared for, if that's not there and you're deconstructing all of the things they have already conditioned themselves to do to get by, then what's left? Just like this. So I think, I don't know if there has to be that linear order, like first build up a strong, healthy ego and then you can start deconditioning maladaptive habits, but there should be some consideration for that. So if you're trying to decondition someone's way of seeing the world and you don't think that there's this deep core where the person actually knows what they want, right, which is my defense against why I'm not so worried about it for most people, now you're in trouble. Right now you've got someone where they don't have any habits to fall back on and there's nothing steering the ship, right? Like, so, and in those cases, I think there would need to be some sort of modification to start actually at least have some kind of value identification that's built into the therapy so they know what they're moving towards, not just what they're moving away from. But I would submit that most people do kind of have a sense of what they're trying to move towards. They do have a healthy enough ego that might be okay, but a more complete form of care would both involve what you're trying to cultivate in the garden, not just pruning out all the pernicious weeds. And right now, the manualized interventions that are at least mindfulness interventions are very much on the pruning out the maladaptive, unwholesome states, not so much, at least explicitly, on cultivating the wholesome states. But they could happen simultaneously, right? And in fact, it couldn't just be all of one and then the other.
Yeah, and I just want to add one more thing. Even if you're trained in ethics, mindfulness, compassion, and I lived in Namgyal Monastery, some of the practices, even in a very well-trained person, can be so powerful that you really need to bring skillfulness, upaya, both internally and externally, because they can generate, like we know, right? Prince Siddhartha was under the tree, and the Mara is manifested as you get more and more closer to stillness. The subtlest noise becomes amplified. So you need to become even more and more skillful to withstand that reverberation. So there's the beginning level with all these MBSR and blah, 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 blah. And then there's the longer part of the trajectory of contemplative development where you need to become even more and more skillful with how this research lab works, this mind-body. Because even when I was in Namgyal Monastery, some monks lost it when they did certain tantric retreats. Thank goodness they were surrounded by 200 other monks who could take action in a moment and knew exactly what to do, which is why we need Sangha, community, each other.
Thank you. Well, taking the cue from Dr. Lazar, as many of the monks and nuns have been psychotherapists before psychotherapy ever became a discipline. So perhaps one of the monks, Ajahn, would you like to address that? Do you need to have a normalized ego or a healthy ego before getting it fixed?
No.
Because you didn't have a healthy ego to start off with. So
No one has a healthy ego.
Okay.
Until they can totally see its fallacy. So we have cases, the case studies of Patachara, which many Buddhist people know, lost her father, her mother, her children, on the same day, and appeared in front of the Buddha totally naked. So all those monks, Buddhists, who ever see a woman in a bikini badly dressed coming into a temple, please don't shove her out. That could be another enlightened patachara. And number 2 is Angulimala. There were many, many people. Kisa Gautami, who lost her only child and had a simile of the sesame seed. All of those cases showed there was very strong trauma, which really challenged, their identity, and with some really powerful teachings to prove that there's no identity there anyway to grieve over. So you don't need a healthy ego or a sick ego to realize there is no ego.
Thank you, Ajahn Brahm. So now that brings to the close of the session 6. And I'd like to, on behalf of everyone here, thank the 3 doctors for making their presentations. Thank you very much.